Hello, my name is Karen Plater, and I'm the Associate Secretary for Stewardship and Planned Giving at the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and I help host these webinars to help congregations and individuals discover the joy of generosity. I hope that you've all noticed that there's a chat box in your screen where you can write questions and messages. We'll have time during the presentation for you to ask questions, and we'll then ask them to Jim. So if you have a question, feel free to type it into the chat box there. Today's presenters are Jim McDonald and Sherry Gross, and I'm going to turn it over to Jim so that we can begin.
Well, thanks, Karen. Our webinar today is called Where There's a Will, There's a Way to Give. And this presentation is happening live at 1:00 p.m. on Wednesday, May 8th, 2019. And I just want to thank you for joining us, everyone. Let's just see here. There we go. So here's a quick reminder that this webinar and the materials we'll be discussing have been brought to you by the staff at the Presbyterian Church in Canada and by generous contributors to Presbyterian Sharing. So I'd like to quickly introduce myself. I'm the new development manager for stewardship and planned giving with the Presbyterian Church in Canada. I have a broad depth of experience in marketing, advertising, and fundraising, including being a development manager for a United Way in New Brunswick. I'm also a member of session at St. Paul's Presbyterian Church in Vaughan, Ontario, and a part-time student at Knox College studying towards a Master of Divinity degree. I just want to mention that you've joined this webinar in listen-only mode, which means everyone but the presenters are muted and video cameras are off. We very much welcome your questions. So as Karen mentioned, please type your questions into the questions pane, and the moderator Karen will read the questions out on your behalf. So I just want to mention our special guest today is Sherry Gross. Sherry is a certified financial planner and a gift planning consultant with Abundance Canada. And for the past 13 years, Sherry has helped donors plan their charitable giving with clients in Ontario and the Eastern provinces. And she has colleagues at Abundance Canada that consult with donors across Canada. Hi, Sherry, are you there? Thanks so much for making this time for us.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here, Jim. Yes, I'm here.
Oh, terrific. Well, I just want to mention that as our special guest, I'll begin with making a presentation, but anytime you want to jump in, please do so. And that's true for Karen, you too, if you have anything you'd like to suggest. And of course, if anybody online has any questions, just jump right in. So I'll begin the presentation, and later on, Sherry and I will talk about Abundance Canada and about a number of other pertinent issues. So let's get started. So this webinar will talk about how churches can plan for receiving bequests without conflict or confusion, and it will help donors to plan for making bequests while protecting their families from unnecessary complications. So let's get started by talking about a surprising fact. Half of us don't have a will. Yeah, according to a 2018 Angus Reid poll, less than 55% of Canadians have a will, and that includes older Canadians. Without a will, your property will be distributed based on a government-mandated formula, and that could cause delays and add costs, and it leaves nothing for charity. So let me briefly recount to you a personal story of one of my biggest heroes. This is a photo of my father-in-law, Adam, with his two grandsons and me back when I had hair around 1999. This photo was taken in the first home we ever bought, a 160-year-old heritage house in Markham, and we loved renovating that old fixer-upper. The bedrooms were small though, so we asked Adam if he could help us plan an addition on the back. Talk about planning. Yeah, if it wasn't for my father-in-law, we could never have achieved that beautiful addition. Adam was retired and he had the time and the skills to organize everything. He did a great job planning out every door, window, and electrical outlet. And during the construction, he got to spend every day around his small grandchildren. So for me, this is a very happy memory. And when Adam passed away a few years later, we had reason again to be really grateful for his talent for planning. He thought of everything. And thank goodness, because there was so much to think about. At every turn, we found that he had provided all the decisions and all the needed information. Adam never stopped giving. Even after he died, he was giving to our family. We were very grateful. So thoughtful planning helps a family to grieve without complications. It helps us to take account of the gifts God has given us and how we want those gifts used in the future. It allows us to share our legacy and tell our faith-inspired story long into the future. So the best practice is to update your will and estate plan at every stage of your adult life so that you won't get caught short. And that reminds me of another story. This is not a personal story. It's a movie quote. See, in the comedy film Love Actually, there's two characters who fall in love despite a pretty terrific language barrier. And the character played by Colin Firth, Jamie, proposes in mixed up Portuguese to the character played by Lucia Moniz, named Aurelia. And Aurelia accepts his proposal by answering in English. He's really surprised and he asks, "You learned English?" And she nods and replies, "Just in cases." I found that a very funny, touching moment. And it illustrates the idea that it's always good to be prepared, just in case a happy event occurs, and just in case life suddenly gets unexpectedly complex. So we want to plan as best we can for the just in cases. And that is why I'm recommending that everyone put together a just in case binder or a file folder or an accessible digital file that contains all your information in one place, so that you can be assured that your spouse and family members or a trusted friend can find the information just in case. I like the binder idea because it makes it easy to update on a regular basis. As we age, the possibility increases that someone will have to take over our affairs if we're incapacitated or should we pass away. Many of us know where to find our important documents, but fewer have put all the information down in one place so that our family or the executors of our estate can locate it easily should something happen unexpectedly. There are a number of places you can go for additional information on this, by the way. One is a book by Sharon Hartung called Your Digital Undertaker, which, despite the morbid title, actually guides you through a pretty comprehensive project management approach to estate planning. And in Hartung's book, there's a section on creating a binder like this. Also, on the Canadian Association of Retired Persons website, you can also find an article about what they call the If Something Happens binder. So it's sort of in the zeitgeist of what's going on right now. People are talking about this a lot. It's a good idea. So to help with this, we've created this booklet, which you can download from the Stewardship and Plan Giving section of Presbyterian.ca. And it acts as a guide to collect the information you'll need to create or update your will and your binder. The booklet includes information that you can quickly go through, some of the major sections of the binder and find what you need if something should happen. It's usually not advisable to use a do-it-yourself will, by the way, which is why the will planning guide and workbook is not meant to be a will. It's helpful. You can take the completed book to your lawyer and save yourself and lawyer a lot of time, but it's not a will. Okay, so once you have a will, where is it kept? So list information on where to find you and your spouse's wills and powers of attorney, living wills, etc. That's what you do. You don't put the will in here. You list where you can find it. And the contact information for your notary or a lawyer. And since you may decide to change your will at some point, it's probably a better idea not to keep it there because you end up with multiple versions all over the place. By the way, if you live in Quebec, which doesn't require probate of a will, you might want to just include the contact information for the Register of Testamentary Dispositions of the Chambre des Notaires de Quebec, which is a government agency. You don't have to have a lawyer. Let's jump ahead. So as we age or in the circumstances of ongoing illness, it's a very good idea to pre-plan your funeral since there are many decisions to be made. In fact, there are so many decisions to be made around that process that we need a whole webinar just to cover them. Suffice to say that organizing your funeral takes a huge burden off the shoulders of your survivors. So, you should usually include this information in the binder. Let's jump ahead to the next slide. Now you'll need your income and pensions information. You can think of all the numbers your family will need, social insurance numbers and pensions and information from other countries if you ever immigrated or worked there, banking and investments. So all these numbers need to be kept somewhere so they can be found in an emergency. If you have valuables that you wish to give to specific beneficiaries, include the location of these items. Your house, condo, and apartment bills. I mean, you can imagine all the different bills and people are just not going to be aware of. So you should collect this information in like mortgage information and contact information for tradespeople or a neighbor that might have information about your security system so you can get into the house or so they can get in the house. So before your home can be sold, it may require some repairs and cleaning. You'll have property tax info that's needed, telephone, internet, and cable. All these things should be listed in the binder. You'll need contact information for your doctors and dentists. This kind of contact information is useful for many reasons. The contact information related to your public and private medical plans are pretty important. Travel insurance information if you're a snowbird, and you'll have to update the book regularly if you're getting travel insurance a la carte. Account numbers for your life, house, and car insurance, that sort of thing. And if you use Outlook or a similar email package, you may be able to print out your important contacts on paper or to PDF. If you can only do this by printing out the whole list, you can make a handwritten note to clarify which are the important contacts, the ones that are pertinent. And if you can't print your contacts, just write them out in the area provided in that will planning guide and workbook that we make available. Karen, at this point, I wanted to ask you about your story that you told me about your uncle.
Oh, hey, Jim. Yeah, I was just sharing that I think this is an important thing for your family members to know where the contacts are, because when my uncle passed away in the fall, he was on his way to go visit somebody in Vancouver, and we had only her first name, and we never were able to track her down to say, this is why my uncle never turned up to visit you. So yeah, that was kind of an interesting story.
Yeah, it does really relate to this idea of making sure that you have your contacts in a place where people can find them. So I think that's a great example. Thanks, Karen. So the idea, I guess, here is to be prepared. No matter what your age, the work you do now will help your survivors and executors immensely. And as I was immensely grateful when dealing with my father-in-law's death, your survivors will be very grateful if you do this kind of homework. And if you create your binder digitally, you can share updates with your executor. Otherwise, just let your executor know where you keep the paper binder. Sherry, I believe you advise your clients to prepare a just-in-case type binder, don't you?
Absolutely. When often something tragic or sudden has happened, people are grieving, they might be in a bit of shock, and even if you've told them, if something happens to me, look in this space for the information, they may not remember what you told them or who your lawyer was. So absolutely, it's really helpful for people to have a physical document or a digital document that's been sent to them that they can go back and at least start with the basics. Very helpful.
Have you had experiences with families that didn't have this?
Yeah, I've bumped into a couple. A couple years ago, we had some family members of a deceased person call us asking if we happen to have a copy of the deceased's will, and we would never have that or have kept a copy, so we weren't able to help them. They knew that their mom had gone to a lawyer and had her will done. They knew the lawyer's office, and they checked. The lawyer hadn't kept a copy. Mom wanted to take it with her, and to my knowledge, they were never able to find the will.
Oh, wow.
So then the estate's intestate, you're stuck with whatever the provincial regulations are around distribution, and it was quite a mess and took a long time and a lot of expense to sort out.
Now, have you seen your clients struggle with the bills that their loved ones have to deal with when they're intestate, when the will's intestate?
The struggle there, we've certainly had people call us and ask for advice, and we send them off to their lawyers. Sometimes they don't know that the bills are due, if it would come into an email program that they don't have access to, or if it's a login. For example, lots of us log in for utility bills to get totals and make payments. If you don't have that information, it can be hard to track down and find out. And for family members, you know, should those bills be paid, or should they wait for the estate? Yeah, those are good questions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's certainly important to be prepared. So, Sherry, abundance. I have. I've sort of, since we've had a chance to talk, I've got a pretty good idea of what abundance does now, but a lot of people don't. So, first of all, how do you work with new clients?
So we're formally called a public charitable foundation, which means we are a charity that helps donors give money to other charities. We are completely donor advised, so we will take the recommendations and input from donors. So we don't decide where funds go. We would go back to donors, and as long as it's a charitable organization or qualified donee in Canada, we can send funds there. So for individual clients or families, we like to have the charitable consultation with them. So just as you might have a specialist for your financial planner or your wealth planner looks after your assets, you might have an insurance agent or an accountant that look after their areas of specialization. We're the charitable specialists. And so we're able to talk with folks, help them think about a charitable plan, explore giving options. Perhaps that's looking at specific assets they might give. We can help them think about being strategic, making long-term plans. We can even help families if they would like to have a larger family foundation type setup where multiple family members or multiple generations might be involved in deciding how to give funds away to charity.
Oh, wow. I'll have to ask you more about that in a moment. But can donors just call you up for advice?
Absolutely. One of the things I love about Abundance is that our information and our services are really accessible to most people. So the advice side is really at no cost. So folks are welcome to call us up with their charitable giving questions. We talk with advisors, we talk with individuals, we work with both if that's helpful. Meetings are also at no cost, and we can meet either in person if that's convenient. We can also meet over the phone or via Skype if someone prefers. And many of our services are low or no cost, depending on the type of asset that's donated.
Okay. So you were just a moment ago talking about, I believe we were talking about donor advised funds. So I'm going to jump ahead to that. So when donors donate through Abundance Canada, do they have to distribute the money to charity right away?
They don't, and that's one of the benefits of working with a public charitable foundation like Abundance, is we are able to separate that donation and the charitable receipt that's issued at the time of the donation from the eventual distribution of those funds to charity.
Okay. So let me ask you another kind of funny question. Do you need a swimming pool full of money to donate this way?
You don't. Again, we try to be very flexible and accessible to a lot of people. We don't have a minimum donation amount. Our minimum distribution amount is $100. So that makes it accessible to folks with a small amount of money to give to charity or with a very large amount. So if you're Scrooge McDuck, that's great. We'd love to talk with you. If you are more modest, like most of us, we are happy to help, and we're able to do so.
Okay, great. So in what ways does Abundance make giving simpler for some donors then?
Well, I can tell you my story. It seemed every year for a few tax years, I had to track down charitable receipts that I was certain I should have when it came around to income tax time in April. And it seemed like every year there would be one receipt that I had to go back and figure out when did I give and how did I give and contact the charity. And so we eventually decided to work with Abundance Canada and make donations here. We get one charitable receipt per year from Abundance, which makes our income tax time much simpler. And we're still able to support as many or as few charities as we choose. We're able to look at predictable cash flow for donors making gifts to charity. So for example, if the donor's income fluctuates, they might not want to pass those fluctuations on to their church or to the other charities that they support. They can make donations, larger donations when their income's up, smaller donations when it's less, and then even out the amount that would go out to their church and other charities. For regular donations, we can set them up to begin each quarter. So if you were wanting to switch to using something like Abundance to make your church donations, instead of giving monthly or weekly, you could give quarterly at the front end of the quarter. So your donation to your church for January, February, March could all go in January. So your church has those funds in advance. They can cover expenses and look after the ministry that they're called to do. Right. Especially for older donors, those of us who have busy lives, which is almost everybody I bump into, all your giving details are in one place when you work with a foundation like Abundance. So that can really simplify things. Again, you've got one place to call, one person to contact, and it can be looked after.
You know, sometimes I've heard that donors like to be anonymous. Is that something that Abundance can provide?
We can provide that service. It's not very common, but sometimes there's larger gifts. There's specific circumstances where people don't want the charity to know their name at all. And we know who the donor is. We've issued the charitable receipt back to that donor, but we simply pass the gift off to the church or charity as a gift from a friend and don't share any other information. So we can provide that complete anonymity if that's something that's desired.
Okay. Great.
Jim, I'm just going to jump in here a little bit. So people know that the Presbyterian Church in Canada and Abundance, so I work with Sherry through something called the Canadian Interchurch Stewardship Committee, and we share best practices and experiences and ideas for how we can equip congregations. The unique thing about Abundance is that they can provide this for any charity that people want to give, not any charity, but for other charities. If you want to give to the PCC, you can do it directly through the PCC, but some people might decide to give to the PCC and want to give to other charities. And the PCC doesn't establish donor-directed funds. So I love working with Sherry and how we can share our best practices together.
Thanks, Karen.
Thanks. So I did want to remind everyone that they can ask questions of Sherry if they want, or about any of the subjects that we're talking about right now. So I'm going to jump to another subject, Sherry, which is the idea of preparing for gifts and avoiding conflicts. I know you have some experiences with this. Basically, what are the challenges faced by churches when they haven't prepared for a bequest?
Well, I've heard from a few donors over the years. So we would talk with folks about lifetime giving as well as thinking about giving it after they've passed away. And occasionally I bump into folks who say, oh, no, I would never leave money to my church because they'll just fight. And they'll recount a story to me of the last time somebody had passed away and left money to the congregation. There was maybe a bit of a battle or a disagreement. And so in the end, often money is simply placed into the general budget, and people aren't sure if that's in keeping with the donor's wishes. They're not sure that they should then provide this extra gifts to the church at death. And I think that's unfortunate. I think congregations where they can have some conversations ahead of time and really think about what they're called to do as a congregation, what God has given them to accomplish in the world, and think about how these additional funds might be used to fund those things. And that can create some excitement for people as well. That if they're preparing documents and thinking about gifts to the congregation, can think about, if I give to my congregation, I know that they'll do this with it, and that feels really good, and I would love to support that.
Yeah, I mean, if your congregation if your church doesn't tell you that they can handle the money, or deal with the gift, is there somewhere else that a donor would likely go with that money?
So there are a couple books that we've read over the years, and Karen would certainly have encountered some of them as well. And I remember one in particular, a person was talking with quite a wealthy gentleman, a very successful business person, about making a gift to the church. And the gentleman said, no, I would never do that. They wouldn't know what to do with this very large gift. But I know that if I give it to the local hospital or the university or college or another large charitable institution, they would have plans and be able to handle that gift. And again, I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we want people to know that they can give to the church. And one of the best ways to do that is to make a plan. So let's talk about that a little more. You know, because bequests and other planned gifts are often periodic and larger, yeah, it's best for a congregation to be prepared, as I was saying. So bequests and planned gifts provide the opportunity for congregations to do ministry they couldn't do normally. And that's probably the best way to think about it. Stewardship and Planned Giving has prepared this document, this free downloadable booklet, Setting Up Legacy Funds and Endowments. And it contains sample policies and procedures to guide your congregation through the process of setting up and administering a legacy or endowment fund. Now, Sherry, should an endowment-sized gift be applied to the annual budget?
It's often not best practice. And again, it might vary depending on the size of the gift that's coming, but they are often larger and unpredictable. So it might make sense to have a different plan and think about supporting the future ministry of the church. Again, where is God calling you? What are the things that you might want to think about? What are the things that you feel called to do that aren't fully funded or aren't funded at all, perhaps? And is that something to pay attention to as you're making your plan?
Right on. So the endowment and legacy policy, a policy can also provide the foundation for promoting legacy gifts. So helping donors to see how their gifts will be received, how they'll be invested, how they'll be used. Creating a new legacy giving policy or updating the one you have provides the perfect opportunity to let your members know that your congregation is prepared to receive such gifts and to use them well. So Sherry, how would you suggest a congregation prepare for future endowment and legacy gifts when they have no expectation of an immediate gift? Should that even be a motivator?
I think there's an opportunity for this session perhaps to have a time of daydreaming. Again, where is God calling us? What are the needs that we see? What are the things that we feel we're called to do? And we have then a list of ideas, some things to go back to if we do receive a very, very large gift, and we can think about how we might use that.
So how does a congregation best handle an unexpected outsized legacy gift to minimize conflict?
So the people we work with come from a wide variety of denominations, and I am aware of a few congregations that have received very large gifts, multiple millions in bequests, quite unexpectedly. And so in a few cases where the church has successfully navigated this challenge, they would have formed a committee to explore investment options, and not to make decisions right away, but simply to explore all the options that are available. Another committee might be tasked with looking at the congregational needs, the places God is calling them, and the opportunities that might be in their community or in the broader church. And again, gather that information, not to make decisions immediately, but simply to have some information and take some time to reflect on it. Perhaps another is tasked with researching church, broader congregation or community needs outside of the immediate congregation or even the broader denomination to say, are there things in our community that we would like to support? Are there missions? You know, perhaps our denomination is doing something overseas. Is that something we're feeling called to support? And again, you can think about how and when those funds could be used.
Oh, thank you.
That's a great idea, Sherry. I'm going to jump in, Jim, and just share.
Oh, terrific.
It was interesting. We had Stewards by Design on the weekend, and one of the case studies we had presented was from a congregation who did just that. they have a policy for their endowment fund that allows a portion of it to support the immediate needs of their congregation and perhaps some needs the board of managers identifies, but then a portion of it goes to support their community efforts and people who come to them with dreams and ideas that align with their vision. And then some of it goes to support Presbyterian sharing and the mission we do together. So I think it's awesome how they can bless others with the endowment fund that has been blessed by that to them.
Great. Well, we'll move on to, I think, something that is similar to what you were asking or talking about. Sherry, what are the various options and best practices for developing an endowment fund in your experience?
So an endowment fund is generally understood to be a long-term fund, but they can be established in different ways. And so hold the word endowment loosely would be my advice. They could be perpetual, so they would run until the organization ceases to exist. And one of the challenges there is that if there aren't constant contributions to the fund, inflation can become a serious problem, and the purpose may change. So if I look at my congregation, if I think about other congregations I know, and look back 20 years or even 50 years, would they have identified that many years ago a purpose for funds, their primary need? Would that still be something that would be in place today? And often the answer is no. So the challenge, again, setting up those guidelines for how that fund is used can be a big challenge if it's a perpetual fund. There can be, for example, I had a person I worked with here, there was a scholarship set up in the 1980s with $10,000, and it was to support a graduating high school student heading for a specific type of post-secondary education. And it provided enough to help support tuition at the time in the 80s and even into the 90s. It was helpful. If you come into the 2000s, that couple $100 that the fund was producing, because it was still $10,000, it was invested quite conservatively, and of course it wasn't even covering the cost of a single textbook, never mind contributing to tuition.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it really ceased to serve its purpose. So what congregations might consider is something called a 10-year fund or a 10-year gift, where the principal is protected for a 10-year period, but after that it can be accessed on a first-in, first-out basis. So that gives the congregation some longevity with the fund, some assurance it won't all be pulled out immediately, but also gives them some flexibility as needs arise, as inflation's an issue, as things change, that they can start drawing down that fund if that would make the most sense for them.
Right, and you don't establish rules necessarily, you establish guidelines.
Yeah, and that's where it would be really good to explore your options and make sure you understand, if you are establishing one of these long-term or permanent funds, what you are and aren't able to do, what kinds of changes you may or may not be able to make. There are charitable rules, there's trust laws that come into play, so it can be fairly complicated, so definitely get good advice before you proceed with setting it up.
All right, Karen, you've seen this in the PCC as well.
Oh yeah, it all depends on what different needs are. And I think looking at the gift and saying, what do you want to accomplish is important, and then designing the gift around that way. And you want to celebrate the generosity of the giver. You want to honor the intention that it will help the ministry go on and fund future dreams for the church, but you also want to say, okay, well, what's the best design? And we often have established funds that, exactly as what Sherry said, they're small funds, and I've seen different congregations, for example, they've had $5,000 as their Christian education endowment. Well, that's not providing very much at this time. I'm actually seeing a question pop up, so I'm going to ask that as it comes. Here's the question. Not sure I understand the difference between rules and guidelines. Can you give an example?
Silence. I'm afraid I can't, but maybe Karen, have you got an idea?
Well, I think that becomes when you say rules or guidelines. I think you do want to have rules, but you want to write into the rules opportunities when things will change, exactly with what Sherry said. So when there's no longer use for a fund, that there are options that it can be redirected for something in a similar nature. So for example, if it was the scholarship fund that she was talking about and it got to the point where it really wasn't providing enough money to support a student, that it could be either finished at that time, it could be dissolved to help students in the year. So it's not necessarily that we don't want rules or guidelines. The idea is that we want to build the rules and guidelines that we have so that there's flexibility, so that they can be flexible with changing times. At the same time, you want them strong enough to be able to guide people's decision-making processes, so that you're not creating conflict over everybody's different interpretation of what the rules and guidelines are.
Yeah, I think to some extent that it comes down to the idea of trying to avoid conflict as much as possible. So during the process where you're developing the endowment policy, you have a set of guidelines that everyone is agreeing to, and you try and make it as loosely held as possible, right? But in the end, there will have to be rules because it's a written document. So, okay, let's jump ahead to the next slide. So if your congregation does not have an endowment or legacy policy in place, now is a good time to begin thinking about how you can handle planned gifts. It is much better to work through such policies before your congregation receives such a gift. So the discussion can focus on the congregation's vision of ministry rather than personalities. So if you're interested in setting up an endowment fund for your church, or if you need other resources from stewardship and planned giving, I invite you to visit presbyterian.ca/plannedgiving/resources. And if you have any questions at all on this subject, now would be great to ask, but you don't hesitate to call the Stewardship and Planned Giving Department for more advice.
I'll just say a little, I'll just say a little note on that. The endowment workbook, it's really great in that it does talk about the difference between strict endowments. When a strict endowment is where you save your capital and you're spending the interest, and these different types of endowments that or different types of funds, internally restricted funds, where they're set up and designed in different ways. So sometimes it's that 10% of the total fund will be spent until the fund reaches a certain amount. So it sort of recognizes that there's all these different types of flexibility in those funds, and it provides language in it that you can look at and say what best suits our ministry and what we're trying to achieve with this fund. So it's a pretty dense workbook, but it's got lots of sample language. You can cut and paste. In fact, you're intended to cut and paste and build one that will suit your congregation and the funds that you're trying to establish.
Yeah, the book actually has an explanation of an idea and then a sample, and each chapter is followed by a sample. So it's a very useful, well-designed workbook. So, all right, so let me just move on to say that I should mention that your congregation, if you are part of a congregation and you're watching today, it won't know that they can give a legacy gift unless they're reminded on occasion. So I'd just like to remind you that you can access bulletin inserts for your congregation that explain legacy giving, including bequests, which is covered in the blue legacy in your will insert, the second one from the left, the blue one. These can be accessed at no charge from Stewardship and Planned Giving. So we're coming close to the end of this webinar, so I thought I'd ask if there's any further questions. I'm sure Karen or Sherry and I would be happy to answer them. So if anyone has any last questions. Okay.
Well then, wait. We just, you have to give people a few moments for
people
them
have to type.
Sherry, do you have any other ideas if somebody's looking at a bequest? What's important for them in the bequest language to put in if they want to make a bequest to their church or congregation?
So I, again, remind people that it's it's difficult for us to foresee future needs. And so where people are giving to their congregation or to broader church ministries, to be a little bit cautious about giving specifically designated bequests. So to say, the money that I'm giving out of my estate, my congregation can only use for a specific purpose. Again, we don't know what those needs will be in the future. We don't know that that will be the greatest priority. And if it's written that way in the will, then the congregation legally, there's very little wiggle room, generally none available. So giving your congregation the opportunity to make those decisions themselves, or making sure that you say, I would like it used for this purpose, or where the congregation or where the broader church ministries deem most appropriate, so that you give them a little wiggle room, just in case. I think paving the parking lot is a very important thing, but perhaps at the time they need a new roof. And so, you know, you want to be helpful to your congregation.
Right.
Yeah,
The best
great.
example I heard of that was kind of it was amusing, but it was meant as an illustration. And it was if you give to the church's marching band and designate, the likelihood is that money will be locked up forever, right? So it's important to if you're going to designate, to make sure that it's something that can actually be used.
Great. Here, I've got another comment from somebody online. The will planning guide is an excellent resource. I would suggest including additional sections dealing with Henson trusts for disabled beneficiaries and international wills for snowbirds with property or assets outside Canada. Have you ever had to deal with that, Sherry?
I've pointed people to lawyers when they've had those situations. So a Henson trust for a disabled child is an incredibly helpful thing to set up for a whole wide variety of reasons, but you definitely need legal advice around that. And yes, if you have assets outside of Canada, definitely you need to speak with a lawyer that has some experience with that jurisdiction or has contacts in that jurisdiction and can provide you with the best advice to determine how those assets will be administered after you pass away. Otherwise, it's potential to leave a big mess,
Great.
which can be expensive to solve.
Good point. So we'll look and see if we can add a short information, not information about those, but just to suggest people look at their lawyers and see what we can add. Thanks for that suggestion.
Thank you very much.
Here's I've got a few comments now. Awesome information session. Thank you. And somebody else who doesn't have any questions, but thanks for the presentation.
Oh, great.
So
You're welcome.
I don't see any other questions that have come in, so.
Well, then I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for attending our webinar. Please note that you're welcome to contact Karen or I in the Stewardship and Plan Giving Department, or Sherry Gross at Abundance Canada. Here's our contact information should you need it. I'd just like to remind you that this webinar will be posted online later today, so you can review any of the information provided at your leisure. So once again, thank you from Karen and Sherry and me, and have a great rest of the afternoon. Thanks very much, Sherry, for helping us out today.
Thank you for inviting me. It was lovely to talk with you.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thanks so much.